Hello and welcome back. I'm sure most of you are familiar with He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe. He-Man's mythology comes from a combination of sources, which include the Mattel toy line and the stories contained within the various mini-comics. But the source most familiar to fans is the Filmation cartoon. In that classic show, we learn that Adam, Prince of Eternia, is granted fabulous powers when he holds his magic sword aloft and speaks the words, "By the power of Grayskull." A magical bolt from the sky transforms Adam into He-Man, who in turn can transform his meek but faithful tiger companion Cringer into the mighty Battle Cat. The source of He-Man's power is the mysterious Castle Grayskull, which is watched over by the magical sorceress. We eventually learn that Adam has a long-lost twin sister named Adora, who through her own magic sword can become She-Ra, Princess of Power, who also draws her power from the mysterious Castle Grayskull. When I first watched He-Man in the 1980s, many elements from that show seemed very familiar to me, as the transformation from Adam to He-Man is a classic wish fulfillment power fantasy. The idea that any of us could become stronger, smarter, faster, and better than we are, and that we could use that power to fight against evil and become the hero. It's a classic fantasy of most children, and many adults, but the idea certainly didn't originate with He-Man. In this video, I'm going to take a look back at some of the characters from my childhood that use many of the same elements that we find in He-Man's mythology. And our journey is going to start all the way back in 1939. And we can go back there through the use of one magical word.
SHAZAM!
Captain Marvel was created by writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck in the pages of Whiz Comics. A young orphan boy named Billy Batson is summoned to a mystical place called the Rock of Eternity. There he meets the wizard SHAZAM, who informs Billy that he has been chosen to become the wizard's champion on Earth. When Billy speaks the wizard's name, SHAZAM, a magical bolt of lightning comes from the sky and transforms Billy into the mighty Captain Marvel. The word SHAZAM is an acronym based on the names of 6 immortal elders: Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, and Mercury. When Billy speaks the name, he acquires the wisdom, strength, courage, stamina, and speed of those immortal beings. Captain Marvel fought a variety of colorful villains during his adventures, and eventually a group of characters formed around him that would become known as the Marvel family. These include Billy's long-lost twin sister, Mary Batson. When Mary spoke the word SHAZAM, she was gifted the abilities of 6 immortal goddesses, and she became Mary Marvel. Another addition to the Marvel family was Mr. Tawny, a civilized anthropomorphic tiger who could speak to humans. SHAZAM became hugely popular in the 1940s, and at one point his comics were the best-selling superhero comics on the market, even outselling Superman. Unfortunately, DC Comics took note of this and filed suit against Fawcett Comics, the publishers of Captain Marvel. DC alleged that Captain Marvel was merely a copy of Superman, which in my opinion wasn't really the case, as the similarities between the two characters are pretty superficial. They both can fly, wear capes, and have super strength. Other than that, their origins and backstories are completely different. This legal battle lasted for years until DC eventually won, and forced Fawcett Comics to stop publishing the adventures of Captain Marvel in 1953. Captain Marvel lay dormant until 1972, when, ironically, DC Comics licensed the character from Fawcett and integrated him into the DC Universe alongside Superman. Eventually, DC took full ownership of Captain Marvel and the Marvel family of characters, and they have been members of the DC Universe ever since. But in the time that Captain Marvel was out of publication between the mid-50s and the early 70s, the name Captain Marvel fell out of copyright, something that did not get unnoticed by Marvel Comics publisher Stan Lee. Stan instructed his creators to come up with a character that could use the name Captain Marvel, which they did, and even though that original character was killed off, a string of different characters using the Captain Marvel name has been published by Marvel since the late 1960s. If only so Marvel Comics can retain the trademark for the name. Since that happened, DC was able to call the character Captain Marvel within the pages of their comics, but they could not title the comic itself Captain Marvel. So they titled his reboot comic SHAZAM. All subsequent television shows and films based on the character have also been titled SHAZAM. Over the years, DC Comics has attempted to alleviate the naming confusion by trying to change the character's name from Captain Marvel to simply Shazam, which wouldn't make sense as every time he tried to introduce himself, he'd transform himself accidentally. But there was a pushback by comic book purists who insist that the character still be Captain Marvel. In recent publications, writers have simply referred to the character as the Captain. In the mid-1970s, Filmation, who would go on to produce the He-Man cartoon in the 1980s, created 2 television shows based on Shazam. One was an animated series called The Kid Power Hour featuring Shazam. The other was a live-action television series for Saturday morning, which starred Michael Gray as Billy Batson and 2 different actors, Jackson Bostwick and John Davey, in the role of Captain Marvel. That show also introduced a character called Mentor, played by Les Tremayne, who would travel around America with Billy in an RV and assist Billy and Captain Marvel during their various adventures. Shazam hit the big screen in 2019, starring in a feature film that was part of the DC Extended Universe. The film starred Asher Angel as Billy Batson and Zachary Levi as Captain Marvel. A sequel called Shazam! Fury of the Gods was released in 2023, but was not as well received as its predecessor. When we look at the origin of Captain Marvel, we see some elements that are very familiar to He-Man fans. A magical place, the Rock of Eternity, a magical mentor in the form of the Wizard, a lightning bolt that grants fabulous powers, a long-lost twin sister who shares in those powers, and a talking tiger. Let's move on to another example where some more familiar elements come into play. Our next stop on the journey is 1967, and the creation of the Mighty Myor. In the late 1960s, Saturday morning cartoon powerhouses Hanna-Barbera created a wide array of original superheroes for Saturday mornings. Among them were Space Ghost, Birdman, and the Herculoids, as well as the prehistoric superhero Myor. Let's take a look at the origin of Myor.
While on a hunting trip, Tor and his faithful companion Tog rescue an ancient hermit. Grateful, the old man gives Tor a club, which possesses great powers. Tor raises the club, and he becomes Myor, and Tog is transferred into a fire-breathing dragon. Together, they become champions of good and the nemesis of evil.
Myor's adventures ran from 1967 to 1968. He shared his half-hour segment with a new heroic version of the legendary white whale Moby Dick. Moby Dick and Mighty Myor lasted for 18 episodes. The 30-minute episodes were divided into 3 segments, 2 for Myor and 1 Moby Dick sandwiched in the middle. That means there were 36 individual episodes where Myor and his dragon companion Tog defended their prehistoric home from all manner of men and monsters. Looking at Myor's origin, we see some more of those familiar elements that I was talking about. Myor has a club which is his weapon of power that he holds aloft to transform, while simultaneously transforming his animal sidekick into a bigger, stronger version of himself. Yes, Battle Cat, but I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Nothing to worry about. Down boy, good boy. Before we get to He-Man in the 80s, there's one other example of this type of transformation that I'd like to cover, and it's a favorite of mine. And for that, we don't have to go far because we're still in 1967, and still in Hanna-Barbera's Saturday morning wheelhouse. And our next example is Young Samson and Goliath, sometimes simply called Young Samson, sometimes called Samson and Goliath, not to be confused with Mighty Samson, Doc Samson, or Davy and Goliath. Unfortunately, Hanna-Barbera never provided an origin story for young Samson, but this is what we know. A young man, perhaps a teenager named Samson, and his little dog Goliath travel around the world on their moped. Yes, that's right, I said travel around the world. I don't know how they get across oceans in the moped, they just do. When Samson encounters trouble or evildoers, he clanks together his two magical wristbands and transforms into a super-heroic version of himself, who we assume has the strength of the legendary biblical hero after which he's named. Samson can then clang the wristbands together a second time in the direction of his dog Goliath, which magically transforms Goliath into an enormous lion, a giant cat that Samson sometimes rides into battle. Besides super strength, Goliath also had laser beam eyes and a mighty roar that could seemingly shatter mountains. When young Samson transformed, besides becoming bigger and stronger, his hair also grew to just above shoulder length. And yes, it's a very nice haircut, Adam. Nothing wrong with it. Looks good on you. For 20 episodes, Samson and Goliath fought supervillains, giant robots, monsters, witch doctors, and all manner of cartoon threats from the 1960s. So with all that said, am I saying that the creators of He-Man ripped off any of these previous properties? No. I see a lot of discourse online calling one thing or another a ripoff of something that came before it. And that is a gross oversimplification of the creative process. There are such things as inspiration and homage. At this point in our history, humans have told millions of different stories over the course of thousands of years. Everything is going to be derivative of something, everything is going to remind you of something else. It's how you take those familiar elements and use them in your own work that counts. And there are hundreds of different examples that I could probably cite. I'll just go through a few off the top of my head. George Lucas was obviously influenced by the adventure and sci-fi serials he watched when he was young, when he created Star Wars and Indiana Jones. We can see elements of the Galactic Patrol from the novel series Lensman in DC's Green Lantern Corps, just as we can see different things from the Green Lantern Corps in Marvel Comics Nova Corps. Pulp heroes like Doc Savage and the Shadow, preceded comic book superheroes like Batman and Superman, and the entire superhero genre can be traced all the way back to legendary heroes like Gilgamesh, Hercules, and King Arthur. And I've talked about the origin of Godzilla in depth on this channel before, that character being inspired not only by real-life events, but by the film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. So simply calling something a rip-off of something that came before it is pretty disingenuous. It's how you take those elements and mix them together and use them in your creation. Obviously, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe have millions of fans worldwide, from the US to the UK, from Ireland to the Netherlands, and all the way to Australia. I don't think the same can be said for Myor or Young Samson. But I saw a quote from someone online one time that said, franchises like Star Wars and He-Man wear their inspirations like a fine suit, and encourage you to explore what came before them. Which is the entire point of this video. If you're a fan of He-Man and looking for something new to explore, maybe take a look at some of the characters I just mentioned. There is no shortage of comic books featuring Captain Marvel, aka SHAZAM. From the Golden Age to the Modern Age. You can find many of those stories in printed collected editions, as well as digitally. And did you know there was even a DC He-Man crossover one time, where He-Man actually gained the powers of Shazam? True story. As far as the tie-in media, both the Shazam films from the DCEU are readily available, and as far as Filmation's 1970s productions, the entire live-action series has been released on home media, and can be found on streaming. Unfortunately, the animated SHAZAM series only received a partial home media release way back in the days of VHS. But as of this recording, all 12 episodes of that series can be found on YouTube. Complete series for Hanna-Barbera's Myor and Young Samson have both been released by Warner Media, and as of this recording are still in print and readily available. As far as the creation of He-Man himself, do I think any of the creators were inspired by any of the elements from these characters I just talked about? It's quite possible. As stated, Filmation created 2 series starring Shazam in the 1970s before working on He-Man. And being that Filmation was Hanna-Barbera's chief rival for Saturday morning programming throughout the 1960s and 1970s, I'm sure they kept up with what Hanna-Barbera was doing. That's it for this one. Hope you enjoyed it. Now go watch some cartoons, and I'll see you in the next video.